All right, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge and I'm convening this webinar for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and practical application of the social capital concept, and the association is now welcoming new members. In this session, we welcome Emeritus Professor Lindon Robison for a discussion about the high costs of cheap social capital revisited. Professor Robison was a professor of agricultural and resource economics at Michigan State University from 1977 until 2021. He's recently retired. He has researched social capital since the early 1980s and has played a very important role in its theoretical development. You may be most familiar with his 2002 paper, Is Social Capital Really Capital?, which he authored with Allan Schmid and Marcelo Siles. His pioneering research focused on the role of social capital, relationships of caring, trust, and regard, on establishing the terms and level of trade, which has been applied to sale prices for land and cars, the likelihood of loan approval, and medical screening decisions. His most recent publications describe social capital motives distinguishing between relational goods and commodities. So welcome, Lindon. It's great to have you join us again.
Good to see you, Tristan, and hello to everyone who's joining us on live. I look forward again to a very helpful and productive and lively discussion.
Right. So let's talk about where we came from originally. So we had a webinar in 2021 talking about the high costs of cheap social capital. And since then, you've developed the ideas quite significantly. We've had regular discussions about it as well. You've published these two papers, the cheap side of social capital and the high cost of cheap social capital, which are both published on the Institute for Social Capital website and are freely available for anyone to access. And in those articles, you really dug into these ideas and explored them in a systematic way and provided lots of really fantastic examples of what social capital, cheap social capital is, and distinguishing between these different types. So I thought a good place to start would be to explore the differences or the connections between cheap social capital, negative social capital, cheap social capital, and other kinds of relationships.
Thank you, Tristan, for that introduction. And this is a good place. All of us that have been watching the developments and exchanges on social capital recognize that there are lots of different.
Thank you.
It sounds like someone needs to mute their phone. And the one thing that it does seem that we agree on, while we may disagree on the precise definition of social capital, is that it has to do with relationships. And I've distinguished between social capital, negative social capital, cheap social capital, and of course there are other kinds of relationships. So if you wanted to think of the different kinds of social and capital, they're all part of a broader class could all fit under the topic of relationships. Social capital, at least as I've defined it in my work, has to do with our ability to internalize each other's well-being. And the origin of that for me is Adam Smith, where he was very explicit talking about relationships having to do with the ability to internalize each other's well-being. So a binary relationship between me and someone else is if I have empathy, that is, I internalize the well-being of another person or group, I am providing social capital. They are the objects of my social capital. And in the same way that I could have empathy, I could also have antipathy, which would be I internalize their well-being only in a negative sense, such that their improvement in well-being makes mine less. We could think of other kinds of relationships, for example, a buyer and a seller viewing each other as important for a mutual gain, an exchange that leaves them both better off. So we might say this is a strategic connection between two people, that once the opportunity for gain is no longer there, the relationship doesn't exist. The important thing, however, is that relationships can be more complicated. For example, we've discussed binary relationships as social capital and negative social capital, but we could also describe something that we might call triad relationships. And in this case, you might have two or more people who have antipathy for the same person or group, and their relationship, which is shared antipathy,
there you go.
we
Look, it's a
refer to
triad relationships network and an object
as cheap social capital. So their relationship is more than strategic because it exists as long as there is an object of cheap social capital. You could also think of triad relationships where two people who are friends have social capital and they face the same opportunity or possible threat, but because they internalize each other's well-being to protect or take advantage of the opportunity and advantage each other, they have a different relationship. And perhaps the best characterization of a social capital triad would be family businesses who together have social capital for each other and face opportunities outside of their network. So I have there's a little slide there of, we often talk about sports teams that have good chemistry and seem to perform better than teams that aren't connected. So there's one other triad relationship, and that is things that are connected to people with who are the objects of our social capital or cheap social capital also acquire a special meaning or value, and we refer to these as attachment value goods, and we may treat them differently than we would simply an object whose value is associated with their commodity value, their physical characteristics. So in our sort of vocabulary, we have social capital and negative social capital that are sort of biad or binary relationships. We have cheap social capital and positive social capital that could exist in triad relationships, and then attachment value and goods and attachment value bads that are associated with the objects of our social capital and cheap social capital.
I think an important distinction is that a lot of the literature looks at negative social capital based on the outcomes that it produces. You know, if it produces exclusion, then it's considered to be negative social capital. Whereas I think the key distinction you're making here is that we're talking about the nature of the relationships involved, which kind of separates it from the outcomes that might be produced. Because we know that when we focus too much on the outcomes in our definition of social capital, we tend to end up with, a tautology or something that doesn't actually really make sense or is difficult to define. And I think that's characteristic of your approach to social capital, your conceptual or theoretical approach to social capital, is that you define it in a way that doesn't bring in a lot of the conceptual problems that exist in a lot of the literature. You know, like because you define it as empathy and sympathy that one person feels towards another. We don't have those kinds of problems of tautology. And in fact, I was scanning through my list of, the wicked problems of social capital. And as I was scrolling through the list, I became aware that your approach, your conceptual approach doesn't have those problems at least in the same way that most of the other approaches do. So I think that's a useful distinction when we're talking about social capital and negative social capital, what is it that we actually mean by these things?
Thank you, Tristan. That's a helpful clarification. And I guess if I were to make a summary point is when our relationships, we're interested in relationships that are something more than strategic, something that exists because of an exchange opportunity, something that allows us to create another class of goods, social emotional goods that have value beyond their commodity characteristics.
Yeah, and I think as you're speaking, the vocabulary that you're using, the words and language that you're using is quite economic, and that might be unfamiliar with some of the other people who are attending and some of the rest of our audience. And it's something that we've commented on in our discussions as well, that the vocabulary you use is quite different than what I use. I'm not an economist. I'm probably more of a sociologist. And so we're constantly translating each other's language to understand each other. But when we take the time to do that, then I think what we've found is that we're talking about the same things. We might be using slightly different terminology, or maybe very different terminology. Like some of our audience might be unfamiliar with attachment value, for example, or using the term commodities might feel unfamiliar, but we're really talking about the same things, aren't we?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for adding that, Tristan.
And I think that's perhaps where the literature and the body of work tends to fragment a bit when people don't make enough of an attempt to understand the language from different disciplines that people are using. So I think like what we're doing here, I think is really great. And I think it's really good for people to be able to translate each other's language and accept and understand the meaning that's behind it as well. Would be great. So if we move on, then certainly, what we can do together is really impressive. I think we're all very familiar with the importance of social capital. No one seems to deny that as something that is important. Everyone recognizes that. So I guess the next question then is what is the role of relational goods, commodities, and commonalities in the theories of social capital?
So I may need you to translate from economic to something else, but when I think of capital, it requires that it have certain characteristic, and perhaps the most important characteristic of capital as an economist is that it produces something. If a car produces transportation service, or houses produce shelter services, if it's not capital, and if it doesn't endure beyond a single use, and it can be maintained in some other characteristic, we tend to say, well, it's something, but it's not capital. So what is it that social capital produces? And it produces an intangible signal that provides validation, signals of inclusion, self-worth, and the sort of a wider connection. I have a little slide here of two people exchanging commodities and goodwill because they're willing to share. And I will say in a personal reflection, many years ago, when I was first introduced to Dale Carnegie's book on how to win friends and influence people, that has sold 30 million copies and still quite relevant. Looking back on that book, what I see is really a handbook on how to produce and exchange what we call now relational goods. And so social capital, above other things, produces relational goods. Sometimes they can be included in things like an ice cream cone, but that's the product. That's what social capital produces, so that when it's included with other exchanges, it has the amazing property of changing the terms and level of trade and even with whom we exchange.
And really, like, the basis of this is commonalities, but it's perhaps not commonalities in the way that many people would understand commonalities, because I think quite often, particularly in sociology, I think we look at race and gender and these really big commonalities as being the basis for people cooperating or doing things together. Whereas I think what you're talking about with commonalities goes far beyond just those really large scale, very obvious similarities that people may have.
So enabling the exchange of relational goods and even physical goods we call commodities are opportunities that bring us together, that really make it possible for us to share relational goods. And there are two categories: earned, that we acquire through some effort. These could be, we work in the same place, we are members of the same club, we have visited the same place, versus inherited or ascribed, which we acquire by birth, such as race or language of our parents, things that we came. And these two classes have an influence over the kind of relational goods that we exchange, which in turn lead to the development of different kinds of social capital. In fact, I think there may be a slide that would sort of put these sort of concepts together. So if I look at a tree and I look at the roots and the soil and so on, I say those are the commonalities necessary conditioned to produce these relational goods that provide the tree and the branches with nutrients and ability to grow. But then almost every branch of the tree could be a different kind of relationship. It could be, as we talked about before, different kinds of social capital, weak or strong, bonding or linking, and so on. So if I were to think of a paradigm, it would be commonalities or the necessary condition that lead to the production of relational goods that develop social capital, and other kinds of relationships.
And nowhere do we see the power of those commonalities more strongly than in cheap social capital, because it's not just the commonalities that produce the social capital or the negative social capital based on empathy or apathy, or antipathy, but it's those commonalities that actually encourage people who perhaps don't get along or wouldn't otherwise get along to work together on something, to cooperate on something that often ends up having defensive or destructive outcomes, because the commonality is a shared antipathy. And I think that's the beauty of thinking about social capital in this way.
Really well said, Tristan. That is, what happens if you're not in a social capital network, that you don't have a lot of the advantages of being a member of this group that people internalize each other's well-being. And it turns out that what people do, and a very easy commonality to develop, is a shared antipathy, and that becomes the commonality that leads to the development of a cheap social capital network and cheap social capital relationships.
And we'll provide lots of examples of what that looks like in really tangible ways. But I guess the question is, why should anyone care about this? You know, most social capital work just purely focuses on the existence of relationships, the positive qualities and outcomes of relationships. And most of the literature doesn't consider the negative side. And as far as I'm aware, none of it really looks at what we're calling the cheap side, you know, these shared commonalities of antipathy towards other people. So why should we care?
Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. It would be very nice to say, well, let's stay focused on the positive side. Unfortunately, there are threats and potential harm that we need to warn each other against. For example, when we finally got to the point of recognizing the danger of cigarettes and nicotine and cancer producing products, we said we really need to warn people that cigarettes cause mouth disease and other things. And so even though it's not often a pleasant task, we are under some obligation to warn people, in this case, against the high cost of developing cheap social capital networks, which is, I think, going to be the focus of really what follows.
And certainly when we can identify these things, then we can do something about them. And as we'll see, the examples are really compelling. So let's get on to looking at what this actually looks like. What do cheap social capital networks look like? And we've got some examples to share, some details.
So cheap social capital has a breeding ground or a place that it's likely to form, and it usually forms among a certain group that are disadvantaged, feel excluded, and they can identify someone to blame or view as responsible for their condition. On the other hand, they may be people inside a social capital network who feel threatened by people outside that may threaten their condition. So that would be condition one. And condition number two would be, if there's going to be a cheap social capital network, they need a commonality. They need, in this case, an object that they can all agree to blame or to express disdain, someone that is worthy of fear or view as threatening. So condition number two is there has to be an object that they can share antipathy or something, otherwise they can't form as a network. And condition number three is that because they view the object as a threat to their safety or their status quo, they're likely to adopt defensive and destructive acts, or sometimes just apathetic responses to the needs of their object. And these acts are costly. And I have here a picture that United States invested billions of dollars in a wall separating Mexico and the United States. I think it was, I'm not sure that it was simply a defensive act, very costly, not sure what value it has produced. Now, the next trait is a little bit of a concern because the relationship between members of a cheap social capital network aren't strong. They're simply focused on shared antipathy. And as a result of not being strong, they are often subject to manipulation or to being taken over by a strong leader and others who are motivated by opportunities for their own benefit. So there are tiers of influence, but the problem, of course, is they can be expropriated for other purposes. And number five, the last characteristic, although there may be some others, is that they are simply ubiquitous. They are in politics, business, sports, education, science, entertainment, medicine and health, literature, social media. There's simply no place that you can look that you won't find a cheap social capital network, more or less with the same characteristics that we've described.
So, Lindon, did you want to talk through some examples, from some of these, from business, perhaps? Yes,
we could cite some examples. Most of these are current. There's, if you've been following Fox News and Dominion lawsuit. Fox news commentators are being accused of knowing that the election was not stolen, but saw an opportunity to form a cheap social capital network about the election officials and so on. And as a result, the Dominion voting machines are now engaged in a lawsuit. But it all started with a cheap social capital network, a chance to build popularity through a cheap social capital network.
Should we have a look at another example, perhaps sports?
Oh, there isn't a sports team in the world, I'm sure, that hasn't, in some respect, enhanced their solidarity by identifying an object, a competing team or an official or someone that can be used to solidify their own team. And sometimes these really do get out of hand, such as the case where several fans were killed in this conflict between sports teams. So it's a very popular place for creating cheap social capital networks. And I happen to be a member of a few of those as well.
Yeah, let's look at one or two other examples before we move on.
So what gets taught in our school, lots of people have different points of view, and often they become positions associated with certain groups, acquire the characteristic of a cheap social capital object, and people that support a particular educational philosophy are easily identified as the objects of cheap social capital, and groups unite to oppose them. And one of the favorite is sex education, abortion is another, different political views and so on, are all an important part of our education, which we would hope would be something other than that.
And there certainly are a lot of other examples because it really is ubiquitous. You know, we see this everywhere we look. You know, we see it in science, we see it in entertainment. We could be talking about these examples. We see it with medicine and healthcare. Particularly, everyone I'm sure is familiar with some of the cheap social capital networks that have been formed or, in relation to COVID and vaccination and mandates and various other kinds of issues. We see it in literature, we see it in social media, like it really is everywhere. But we should talk also about the animal farm, because I think this is a really good example everyone might be familiar with.
This is my favorite, H.G. Wells and the Animal Farm, really a classic written at the end of World War II, and really is really calling attention in a unique way to the conditions in Stalinist Russia. But the Animal Farm is a story of animals who are convinced that they're being disadvantaged. The chickens have their eggs taken, cows have their milk taken, and they simply view themselves as being disadvantaged by the farmer. And the farmer, of course, becomes the object of their cheap social capital. They view him as responsible for their unfavorable condition. And so they adopt defensive and destructive means or approaches toward their object. In this case, they violently drive the farmer away. And then Napoleon, one of the pigs, subverts the rebellion to gain power and privilege. And unfortunately, the rest of the animals lack the solidarity to limit the power of pigs. And so their condition at the end may have become just as bad as it was at the beginning. So if you want a manual for cheap social capital and how they work, go no further than H.G. Wells and his book, The Animal Farm.
So we certainly see cheap social capital everywhere, and for me, it's incredibly compelling. You know, I spend so much time looking at social capital and focusing on the positive and beneficial things that can come out of it, out of relationships. But here we have all of these other types of relationships and patterns of interaction that can result in all of these, you know, defensive and destructive acts and really terrible outcomes that can occur. So it really is compelling, and it really is everywhere. And I think that this way of thinking about social capital helps to draw attention to that. So the term that you've chosen for this, cheap social capital, you know, can you describe why it's cheap? You know, what are the reasons to use the term cheap?
You'll pardon me if I go back to my an economic analogy that Adam Smith really referred to when he compared water and diamonds. Of course, diamonds are very expensive, precious, and so on, but water is required for life in terms of what it produces. You would think water has much more value, but because water is so plentiful relative to diamonds, we say water is cheap relative to diamonds. And it's cheap because it's so abundant. And one of the reasons that cheap social capital is so cheap is the potential objects are so abundant. They can be strangers, they can be people different, they can be competitors, they simply can be people that we want to take advantage of, blame for our misfortunes, and so on. So the first reason that we call them cheap is because they are simply so plentiful. And the second reason, I'm not sure if I have this slide, the other reason is that they're cheap is because we can create them so inexpensively. In this case, telling mistruth, misrepresenting, or even being led by our own biases can often create an object that is very inexpensive to create. So simply put, if they're not abundant already, we can surely create them very inexpensively.
And linking this to sociology seems to relate to our human characteristic or potential to create groups and have inclusion, but at the same time have exclusion. You know, we often will form groups by uniting against something else, and that exclusion then it's very easy to do. We have a tendency to do it, and those things you mentioned, like it's so easy to lie or to gossip or for our cognitive biases to come into play and you know, interfere with our forming of relationships and easily make somebody else an other, you know, exclude them and make them an object of cheap social capital. It's very easy to happen. And so there's another reason as well, isn't it? Because the results can be inferior.
Yes. So the natural result of a cheap social capital network is to take defensive and destructive acts because of our attitude and our fear or biases toward the object of our cheap social capital. So in the one slide or one picture, we have gated community fences that separate us because of us versus them. And then the actual destructive acts that we actually physically harm or intend to harm the objects of our cheap social capital. These acts are defensive and not and almost anti-productive. At the end, we're less well off than we were before.
Yeah, and there's one final reason as well.
And lastly, when a cheap social capital is formed, unfortunately, it's cheap because it can be manipulated or used for purposes for which it really wasn't intended, and means such as censorship and propaganda, militarization, and so on. And I have in this picture the picture of dictators, because it's interesting that how frequently a cheap social capital becomes subject to a dictator or a strong leader who reduces opportunities and freedom.
Absolutely. So we've talked about why we form cheap social capital. We've certainly touched on that a little bit, but let's give a list. These are some of the reasons that you've identified.
Well, I mentioned in the case of, if we went back to the animal farm as our sort of pattern, we often begin by feeling threatened or disadvantaged, excluded, or we may want to blame others for our condition. In the case of strong leaders, they may want to gain power or influence or some kind of advantage that's available when you create a network. And lastly, unfortunately, there are times when we simply want to act on our antipathy and disadvantage someone who we view with antipathy. So lots of reasons, and not to mention the fact that they're cheap. It's cheap to do.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of costs associated with cheap social capital, as we've touched on, and that's what we talked about back in 2021 when we had our previous conversation about this, the high costs of cheap social capital. But you've done a lot of work since then, and you've been able to explore what these are in a lot more detail and develop these ideas. So shall we run through a few of them? There's probably too many to really go into all of them in detail, but shall we run through a few?
That would be helpful, Tristan. Thank you. So the first one is that it reduces specialization and trade. So when we think, one of the things that economists agree on is that productivity increases when we specialize. And of course, we can't specialize unless we trade. So if you think about the increases in the standard of living and you consider the amount of exchanges in different materials that are required to produce a good, you appreciate the fact that specialization is really, really key. I'm amazed every time I go to the jewelry counter and see some of the inexpensive watches that are available for hardly anything. Of course, you can buy them more expensive. So one of the things that happens when we create cheap social capital and cheap social capital objects is we create us versus them. And when we include relational bads in the exchange, hardly ever are we willing to trade with people we don't like. An example of that was in July 26, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt responded to the Japanese occupation of French Indochina, seized all of their assets, and that was devastating to the economy of Japan. They lost 3/4 of their overseas trade and 88% of their oil. So the natural consequence, perhaps, of this trade, cessation of trade and loss of ability to specialize in trade, was the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 7th. So yeah, from July to December. I suppose besides the next one on specialization and trade, I'll turn you to the next slide, Kristen. Was crime. So we talked about attachment value goods or attachment value bads. An ordered society requires rules and institutions and customs that are generally adopted and sustained without expensive enforcement measures. And when people feel estranged, that is, excluded from the network, not valued by their community. Often this is a motivation to not adhere to the institutions and rules and laws and regulation. I have a quote here from Cohen and colleague that estimated the cost of crime in the United States to be 2.6 trillion in 2017, or about $1,900 for every person. So if you think about the cost simply by misallocating resources or not respecting set basic rights as property rights and other kinds of rights, this is an extremely high cost of cheap social capital. Not to mention
certainly quite a lot more of them as well, aren't there? Many other costs. Perhaps another one to talk about is the defensive and destructive investments as well.
So one of the, and this may support the first slide as well, that in 1940, the US produced 4.7 million cars. During the rest of the entire Second World War, only 139 additional cars rolled off the assembly line. So if you think about all of the transportation investments that were really reallocated to war machinery and the disadvantages to consumers, surely you'd have to agree that one of the high costs of cheap social capital is that it diverts resources to defensive and destructive investments, and including, as we mentioned in an earlier slide, the building of the wall between the US and Mexico.
And certainly lots of other examples. Another one we could touch on, and this isn't by any means an exhaustive list, but another one is loss of freedoms.
So one of the characteristics of a cheap social capital network is oftentimes the links between members of the cheap social capital network are strong. In fact, what unites them is their shared antipathy, which means that they are vulnerable to being manipulated. And often this is the case when a strong leader perhaps gains leadership or even popular support of the cheap social capital network, but then even after the object no longer exists, maintains the power, or maybe comes to power because he uses the cheap social capital object to inspire his followers. So interesting, if you look at the statistics, I think in the world today, there are about 54 dictators, that is a single ruler, a very small group of rulers that basically have autocratic power. And of those dictators, about half of them came to power through coups of some form or another. So there is a connection, at least in my mind, between losing one freedom, and the formation of cheap social capital networks headed by a strong leader. And so other ways of subverting a cheap social capital network is closing, sabotaging elections, popular uprising, number of ways. A very serious threat.
And we've just touched on how cheap social capital networks can be used to further certain goals or aims of individuals or small groups of people. And we've talked a bit about in the past about how within cheap social capital networks, we may see social capital develop. So it may start off as a shared antipathy for an object of that cheap social capital, but as people interact and exchange within that cheap social capital network, they may form social capital. They may form empathy with each other and strong and meaningful relationships. And so we these categories or boxes, that they don't exist in separation from each other. And I think that there's a great opportunity for future research to investigate the ways in which these types of relationships form over time, because just like we could see cheap social capital become social capital in some capacity, we also see cheap social capital just simply perpetuate, or we may even see social capital start to form into cheap social capital over time as well. So I think this is a really interesting area of future research, isn't it?
One of the interesting lessons from history is the American Revolution really began as a cheap social capital network with Great Britain as its object. And after the Revolutionary War was won, it was a very real risk of it becoming a dictatorship, or at least a regal form of government. And fortunately for the colonists, George Washington refused to become that strong leader and insisted on having other leaders follow him. But it was a lot of work to prevent this cheap social capital from becoming sort of ruled by a strong leader.
So all of this is great, but of course, when we identify these sorts of problems and downsides, the next question is, what can we do about it?
Well, I think the first thing is we first need to understand where it began, how does it work, what is the nature of the threat, and then if we have some kind of understanding, does that lead to a natural prescription? Is there strengths and opportunities that we can take advantage as we respond to cheap social capital networks? And so I think that's the place to start.
And you've certainly identified quite a number of these, and let's run through some of them. Some of the things that we can understand, and then some pretty tangible ways we might go about mitigating it.
So the first, I guess, understanding is that if we refer back to the tree diagram, we really begin relationships with some kind of commonalities that provides opportunities to exchange relational goods. And so if we really want to mitigate and limit the formation of cheap social capital networks, we want to pay attention to two different kinds of commonalities. One, commonalities of the us group versus them group, and that actually separate us. And then the second kind of group is what kind of commonalities that would set the stage for us to combine and interact so that we can exchange relational goods with hopefully the opportunities to develop relationships. And I think efforts to provide a common educational experience, I think if there's a lesson that we've learned, that's a very fertile area where if we could provide and increase opportunities for shared educational experience, this could be very helpful in reducing cheap social capital networks.
It really seems like the focus on commonalities, or lack of commonalities perhaps, is something that is a choice that we can all make. We can choose to identify somebody as being different than ourselves on the obvious basis of race or age or gender or class or any number of other things. Or we could actually look past those broad scale differences and see the similarities that exist. We might be both entrepreneurial, we might be both interested in the same sporting teams, we might have the same religious beliefs. There's always going to be commonalities, and quite often there's a tendency for us to focus on those more obvious differences. And the media plays a pretty big role in this as well. Like the media will often portray somebody as being of a particular race or some characteristic that tries to instill fear or identify differences on those really broad scales, rather than identifying the similarities that exist. So, this perhaps is something we could all do, is to look past the differences and see the commonalities, no matter how small they are.
Tristan, if I could share maybe a personal experience. For years, I would lead study abroad groups, and one of the places where we had a program was in Argentina. So I would lead a group of students from Michigan State University, and we would study with students from Argentina, and in addition, they would live in their homes. And it was in just short order. Our students and their students were going on events together, developing relationships, going on trips together, and later would come visit their new friends. And the common expression that the students would come back to me with, even after a short time, was how similar they were with the students from Argentina, that even though they were separated by a language and a large distance, it was amazing how much in common we humans have with each other if we sort of get past the artificial differences that we sometimes separate. Tristan, you shared an experience with me about where you got your haircut that somehow had an interesting influence on you.
Yeah, I've recently moved to Brisbane, so I didn't have a barber. I didn't know where I was going to get my haircut, and I was looking for a barber I could trust. And I came across a couple of Iranian brothers who were running a barbershop, and I saw the commonalities. I didn't see the differences, and I'm aware that a lot of other people perhaps would have gone, oh, they're from Iran, they're different. There's uncertainty. There's a lack of commonality perhaps there. And I simply made the choice not to see that. And through the conversation with the barber, we found an enormous amount of similarity, commonality that we have with each other. We're both young, relatively. We're entrepreneurial. We like similar things. Like, there's so many commonalities you can find when you just simply move past the things you might perceive as being differences.
Yeah.
So let's move on to this. There's a few more to look at. We've got about maybe 5 more minutes before we get to question time.
So I guess I think we've perhaps covered this to some extent, but when we lack commonalities, we don't have that exchange. It is often easy to, because of the biases that we have, to say, well, that person is different, or they're doing what they're doing because of not a very good motive. And it's just sort of our tendency, our natural bias to, instead of us describing, well, it may be something, they're doing this for a particular reason that we can explain, to attribute it to characteristic that we can use to form cheap social capital. So I think building community connections and trying to really adopt some legal remedies that prevent discrimination based on race and ancestry and so on, that could help us perhaps mitigate the likelihood of cheap social capital networks and their formation.
Yeah, I guess when you think about it, discrimination really is that focus on a lack of commonalities, or on those very broad scale differences, without making an attempt to see beyond that to the commonalities that do exist. So I think that we've touched on quite a few things in relation to commonalities. There's also things like truth telling as well.
Boy, this one is almost too plentiful to comment on. We've but a recent example will maybe highlight the point. And that is, if there are no consequences to telling lies, and there isn't really a strong effort to create or expose lies, they can be very harmful. For example, two commentators on Fox News, Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity, both took different views of the COVID crisis, and one emphasis in the way they emphasized the disease's severity. And what researchers found was that those that found the Hannity's viewers waited longer before changing their behavior compared to the Carlson viewers, who were otherwise they were demographically similar. So, and here's two cases where both proclaiming different stories, and of course one was probably more supported than the other. And the more recent example is the big lie whether or not the election was stolen in the US, leading to the January 6th storming of the US Capitol. So telling lies has consequences, and we need to invest resources and effort to make sure that the truth gets out.
And so often, like, lying and truth-telling is so important, because so often these lies are used to create an object of cheap social capital. And so if we can expose those lies, if we can reward truth-telling more in our society through our media and our institutions, then we can reduce the opportunities for these cheap social capital networks to form, and particularly for them to be manipulated if they do form towards individual benefits. So next one is understanding that everyone has biases, cognitive biases, and if we can listen to different points of view, avoid labels, then this will help to reduce those cheap social capital networks.
So I grew up in a very small town. We had a town about 40 miles from where I did, very similar. Both of our communities were agriculturally based. We both had sports team, and in almost every particular characteristic, we were very similar. But my friends and I grew up believing that the community to the west were really inferior in so many different ways. And we just, that was their view of our neighbors. And now at this stage of my life, my wife and I spent a month with some very dear friends who happened to be from this town, and we couldn't be happier together, couldn't be more compatible. So I think we just need to get out. For me personally, when I was 19, my church called me to serve a mission in Latin America for 2 years, a little over 2 years. And the result of that on how I viewed the world, how I viewed other people, how I saw different language was profound. And I will never be the same because of those 2 years living in a very different culture among very different people. So in some cases, we just need to get out more. We just need to associate with people that are different than us and listen to different points of view and try and appreciate how rich our lives can be when we are able to get past our biases.
Yeah, and I think that there's currently about 186 cognitive biases that have been identified. So simply understanding and appreciating that we all have those biases, regardless of how intelligent we are or we think we are, we all see the world in ways that aren't necessarily representative of reality. And so when we understand that, then we can look past those beliefs that we may readily form that may lead to cheap social capital networks. And I think your point about contact and talking with others and communicating can help to produce those kinds of commonalities that can lead to relationships and social capital rather than the formation of cheap social capital as well.
Yeah.
Did you want to say anything else about this slide, or should we move on to the next one?
I'm looking at the clock, Tristan, and it looks like we have had a wonderful conversation. That may be just one more, and I think, am I correct in assuming you're willing to put this slide deck on your homepage for those that would like to come back and visit at their leisure? So
we certainly will. Well, let's talk about covenants and treaties, and then we'll move on to questions.
Okay. So there were one of the long-standing feuds between families in the U.S. involved two families in Kentucky and West Virginia, the Hatfield and McCoys. It started in the Civil War, but it never really got resolved until later, when members of each family, at least one member from each family, married the other, and then it was very difficult to maintain this feud, and they resolved it. And this was a popular method for mitigating conflicts between countries in times past. Catherine of Aragon of Spain marrying King Henry VIII. Of course, that didn't turn out well for Catherine, but the point of it is, when we can sit down and actually resolve differences, it's almost always the case that we don't always have the strongest preference for things that we couldn't negotiate and resolve. So covenants, treaties, contracts, agreement, we think of the powerful nature of family contract, marriage contract, business contract, then creating a means of conducting exchanges without conflict. So surely this has to be one of the important ways that we can reduce or mitigate the consequences of cheap social capital.
So as we mentioned, we'll share this slide deck for everyone who's interested in it. I'll just flag that there are some more slides for you to have a look at. Things like support of formal institutions is another important way we can learn from cheap social capital, changing membership requirements, developing inclusive commonalities, exchange partners, the example being McDonald's and war, which we don't have time to talk about, unfortunately, looking for synergistic exchange opportunities. And then Lindon's also provided a fairly large number of perhaps research agendas that people might like to take up and move forward with in the space of cheap social capital. And I'll just flag that they are here in the slide deck that we'll share with you, quite a number of really interesting opportunities for future research. So with that, let's move to questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand in Zoom, and we'll get to your questions. If you would like to, you can post in the chat, and we'll get to your question. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. If you don't want to do that, if you are not in a position to ask the question yourself, let me know in the chat, and I'll happily read it out on your behalf. So anyone want to start with any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself if you have one. All right, we've got a question in the chat from Alex. So the question is, I'm not sure if this was covered, but can cheap social capital connect to the framework of bonding bridging social capital? From my reading, bonding social capital is usually seen as being more likely to create negative externalities, but cheap social capital does not seem to relate strongly to bonding social capital.
Well, the discussion on different kinds of social capital has included conversations about linking, bonding, and bridging. And even in how we name those and describe them has lacked, not everyone agrees. For example, an important piece was Granovetter's piece on the strength of weak ties and how important it was to have connections between people that were different than you, that were connected to different people. And he called those weak ties. I probably referred to those as linking ties. They're not strong. They're usually associated with earned commonalities. When the bonds are very strong, that is measured by the degree to which we internalize each other's well-being, such as mine exists between family members or others who have experienced very strong exchange of relational goods, like buddies in a war zone or something, or people that are bonded by a marriage contract or something. We often associate those or call those bonding social capital, at least I do. And then we have relationships between people in asymmetric positions like teachers and students, officers and workers, and so on. And we refer to those as bridging, a bridge between two different countries. Now, their connection between cheap social capital and negative social capital is that persons outside of those linking, bonding, or bridging networks can often be disadvantaged, feel excluded, or discriminated against. And the presence of a strong social capital network may produce a dark side, which is antipathy toward them and the creation of cheap social capital. So you might say that cheap social capital and negative social capital may be the downside of social capital.
Yeah, and you explored that a bit in your paper, The Cheap Side of Social Capital. You made that connection between these ideas of empathy and antipathy and different types of relationships, and the existing understanding of bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. But there certainly does seem to be some significant differences, of course, because bonding, bridging, linking tends to define the network configuration, whereas when we're talking about cheap social capital, we're talking about really the difference between empathy and antipathy, and perhaps the existence of a cheap social capital object that people are forming or uniting against. And I don't think the bonding, bridging distinction really captures those underlying reasons or motivations why people are forming these networks.
Yeah, I agree.
So any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand within Zoom. You'll find that on the reactions button down the bottom, or you can post in the chat, and you can either ask the question yourself or I can read it out on your behalf. We're really interested to hear what you think. This is probably quite different than other ideas that are out there in the literature, and it's developing and evolving over time. So we're really interested to hear whether or not you find this valuable and compelling, and if you have anything you'd like to contribute to it. And of course, if you'd like to take it up and do some research in this area.
Tristan, I think I would like to comment a little bit about the definition of social capital. In one of the papers, I reviewed a lot of the definitions of social capital that have been presented by some of the leading scholars in this area. And what I found was that they all seemed to agree that it had to do with some kind of relationship, the way people were connected. And as we've approached it here, we've said, well, we want to capture a relationship that moves you somehow away from an arm's length relationship, either positively or negatively. And obviously, antipathy and empathy do connect us, but they're not the only thing that connect us. I mean, we may have trust in someone that reduces the transactions cost, or they may be connected to someone that we favor. And so I guess I would just like to emphasize the fact that the focus really should be on relationships. And now we've introduced a couple of different kinds of relationship, cheap social capital for one, and antipathy. But someone may want to write a paper about how trust or regard or empathy or compassion or sympathy or something. There's lots of other different emotion that could connect us, and perhaps these have their own set of consequences.
And I think that is the similarity that we see in the definitions of social capital, is that they do all focus on relationships and the importance of relationships. And so I think that's the most compelling thing about your approach to social capital and focusing on empathy, is that it gets to the reasons why people do form relationships and then act differently towards each other as a result of those relationships that they have. And so sometimes it feels like we're talking about very different things. You know, you look at these different definitions that exist in the literature, and it's very easy to see the differences. And really what we're seeing, I think, is differences in terminology or different ways of framing exactly the same thing. You know, relationships matter. That's the underlying idea of social capital. It's just about how we frame it, what sort of terminology we use to describe it. That seems to be the only real difference that exists.
Yeah.
I guess I have sort of a comment and a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So in the formation of social capital, in my just practical experience as I run a real estate business, and I'm also a business consultant, and I actually started talking about this with my real estate investors about 4 years ago, because the people who were able to be skillful at building consistent growth in their smaller businesses tend to had higher levels of social capital. And it wasn't necessarily because of their relationship with their customers. It was because of their ability to build trusted networks of information and teams and resources much quicker than another person who was running the same business. But I find when I try to teach this concept, it's very easy to mistake social capital for just a relationship, because not every relationship, in my view, has social capital, right? Like, not every relationship has that mutual empathy, has that mutual desire for well-being. And I find that unless there's a component of identifying it during its formation that makes it more real. Because I think if you don't identify it as a mutual thing through some type of practical organic exchange, then people mistake real social capital for something else and vice versa. I don't think it's something that you notice, especially early on in your adult life, until it's kind of pointed out to you. Does that make sense?
Kristen, I'm anxious to hear how you respond.
I think we can probably understand what you're talking about if we understand the capital nature of social capital. You know, as Lindon was talking about, the ability for it to do something, that it can produce something. And so from the way I think about it, every relationship, as soon as you know somebody, it has a potential to produce something. That something isn't always good, perhaps. It can result in defensive or destructive acts, for example, or maybe nothing will happen at all. But the existence of the relationship, the fact that I know somebody, the fact that I have some sort of a relationship with them, we've started to develop some shared understandings, to use my terminology, which is very different than what we've been talking about in this session. It creates that potential. And that potential is what I describe as social capital, you know, having and focusing on that capital nature. So I don't know, I think that relates perhaps to what you're saying. What would you like to add, Lindon?
I think for young people trying to get to the next level in life, many of them mistake relationships that don't have social capital for the ones that do. And that's kind of what I'm noticing. And I'm trying to figure out how to get them to understand the difference. because there aren't, especially for millennials now, there aren't necessarily a lot of opportunity for exchange and trust building. So for example, years ago, everyone was at Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or church, and there was a constant exchange of whether it's sentiment or just favors and tasks. There's like a randomness of exchange that would allow people to see the results of social capital. Whereas now there's so much less random exchange in our communities. It's kind of like, I read a lot of the guy who wrote Third Places and I'm forgetting his name. I mean, there's a wonderful writer who writes about this, but with the absence of those third places, I find that people will take sources of high social capital and kind of waste it or ignore it, and then pursue relationships with low social capital because they're confused about where the capital is, where it actually is existing.
So thank you. This is a wonderful discussion and question. And I think we all have an image of the salesperson feigning a close relationship. I remember I got a phone call one time, and the person called me by my name, and we had a pleasant conversation. And I'm all the time racking my brain saying, who is this person? I don't remember, but they're talking as though we're close friends. And then toward the end, they said, and we would like you to contribute to this cause. And so I felt like they were trying to feign social capital to gain an advantage. And so it's always a little bit of a question of what is what is real social capital and what is something feigned social capital. In our research, we have tried to measure real social capital with something else by the amount of sacrifices you're willing to make because of the relationship. In some of our studies, we've used willingness to provide free transportation as an evidence. Sometimes it's the price you're willing to discount. And so yes, social capital is valuable. It's important. The goods that it produces alters the terms and level of exchange. And so we're required to do the same kind of due diligence and careful investing with this resource as we do with other resources. And we're using different using different methods. Some of the dating sites and other kind of sites are able to sift through some commonalities and say, okay, we seem to have these connections. Let's, if we're interested, maybe we can move this to something, a stronger relationship. So we're in a different kind of world right now where we, at least it's maybe less difficult or more difficult, particularly with coming out of COVID, to have face-to-face connections, and we're depending on sort of virtual experiences for creating relationships. So you've identified a very, I think, challenging area and really worthy of a lot of careful research in the future.
I mean,
Perhaps-
a really
Sorry, go
good
ahead, Patricia.
example. A really good example of this is the emergence of Uber, right? Because in the past, you might have just asked someone for a ride, right? And now
Yeah.
we just call an Uber. So there are like 1,000 examples of that that I see, in terms of the transformation of social life in the past 20 years.
Yeah.
And perhaps the very concept of social capital gives us the vocabulary to be able to describe the importance of social relationships. And someone like Ed De Jesus is working on social capital literacy programs for youth to identify and understand the importance of social relationships, and particularly developing and maintaining those relationships with people perhaps who are in positions of authority or power who may be of advantage to them in future. And as soon as you start talking about this, it starts to sound very instrumental, you know, where you're only developing a relationship because you can get a benefit from it. But if people can understand the importance and the value of all of their relationships, then I think they're more likely to invest in them. They're more likely to maintain them, and they're less likely to betray trust and do those things that are going to damage those relationships. And so social capital, to me, social capital gives us the ability to communicate the importance of these things. And hopefully then through these kinds of programs of social capital literacy and understanding what social capital is and its benefits and importance, people will take these relationships more seriously than they perhaps currently do.
I think Michael has his hand up, or Michael.
Yeah.
One is like, how would you measure these concepts with quantitative data? Because like, it seems like you would need social network data, but this is like, that kind of data is like rarely available at like regional or country levels, where I think this concept seems to be most relevant, or at least from the anecdote provided. And then the other question I have is about whether this type of social capital conforms to like other notions of capital, such as like investment, stock, and depreciation.
Great question, Michael.
Thank you.
So let me just give you a little anecdote that may help. When I was growing up, my dad and his cousin had neighboring farms, and they would trade work. They had informal agreements. It was very collegial and so on. And then as farms became more mechanized and larger, almost all of those agreements were, went by the way, and more formal contracts replaced the informal contracts. And so we have so many means of efficient exchange. And I was in Spain for a while, and the shopping people in going to small shops was such an important part of the culture. And then larger stores and businesses made that kind of go away. And so we're in a society, or at least we seem to be, where the face-to-face exchanges, the role of Amazon and so many things that we don't exchange face-to-face. And I see a lot of the malls and so on that we used to go to shop in person aren't thriving as much as they were, and even our groceries we can call in. And so the question is, how can we satisfy our need for social emotional goods? How do we feel like we belong? How do we get this validation that can only come from another person? Or how do we offer acts of service? And I think that's another topic. That's a topic for another day, of how we can be involved in the exchange of relational goods. So the question is this a concept that can be measured? Is this really a legitimate area of research that will pass scientific muster, so that we can produce and discuss and create work that people value and say, yes, that's legitimate science. And I have done some work, I hope passes academic muster about the discounts you're willing to exchange for relational goods. That is, what kind of a commodity reduction am I willing to give in exchange for relational goods? I compared it to buying an airline ticket with miles or dollars. I routinely have exchanges where I ask a friend for help. We're not giving any money, but we're exchanging relational goods. And I think we're going to need to be creative in the future, either through some kind of organization, service organization, church organization, on becoming more proficient at exchanging relational goods, because these are so valuable for our health, our emotional health, our longevity, and so on. So yes, I believe we can research it by looking at the trade-offs between relational goods and commodities. I think it's absolutely essential that we recognize the role of relational goods and how as a society that we may be eliminating some important and valuable opportunities for exchanging relational goods.
And Coleman also asked in the chat about a possible measurement methodology for the spectrum between empathy and sympathy and apathy and antipathy. And it seems to me that we're already measuring the way people's attitudes towards others through measures of trust, for example. And so there already is an established scientific process for measuring these kinds of attitudes. And I think we just need to extend it into something like empathy and antipathy in the same kind of way. You know, it tends to be conditional, you know, it tends to be specific, contextual. So it has a lot of similarities perhaps with a concept like trust. And so therefore, I'm sure it is very measurable in that way. And similarly, depending on the scale, I think this is where, you know, the conversations Lindon and I have had about this, our mind just spins with the possibilities for research, because just simply identifying the objects of cheap social capital that exist within a particular community or society can be a way of measuring the potential for cheap social capital to exist. You know, how you could be asking people about, you know, obviously not using the phrase cheap social capital, but asking them to identify these kinds of objects that they unite against, these objects that may exist. And that in itself would be a very interesting measure of the potential for defensive and destructive acts within any particular community or society. So I think there's huge opportunities for research in this area.
Tristan, one of the things that I think our exchange has taught me over this past year is that social capital is clearly a multidisciplinary topic. No particular discipline owns it. It cuts across at least all of the social science disciplines. And when I say we need to get out, we also need to get out into talk with other scientists in different disciplines and try and make sure that we have a perspective that includes insights that we may lack from our own background.
Yeah, for certain. Now, there's a question in the chat from Tim. Tim, did you want to unmute yourself and ask that question yourself? You'll be welcome to.
Sure, thank you, Tristan. Yeah, good afternoon. You know, I kind of just looking over, you know, your work and your past, you know, with Michigan State and everything, and you know, in researching and measuring social capital and your work in rural and economic development, like, what are some ways, and this is probably a very, you don't have to answer this question now, it's probably a much longer response or whatever, but what are some ways that you have seen communities and neighborhoods, small towns, improve themselves using social capital, cheap or otherwise?
Well, what a great question. And I think some of the original work on social capital by Robert Putnam, comparing communities in northern and southern Italy, and noting that when there were sort of a lot of community organizations, choirs, clubs, and so on, that the community which provided the commonality for sharing relational goods, I'm using my language, not his, that people were more willing to invest in public goods, roads, schools, and so on. And you could do things when you had the social capital that you couldn't do through strategic exchanges. And so I think one of the great lessons is that economic development or social development, it surely needs to take account of this tremendous resource. In fact, will unlikely be successful without it.
Yeah, I think I would add that so often we see social capital identified as being really important, but we don't necessarily see initiatives and policy decisions that take it into account and help to build social capital. So I think that's something that I'd love to see a lot more of, is not only lip service paid to its importance, but it actually being incorporated into the way in which we do things. There certainly are some examples around the world and some really fantastic initiatives that have been done based on the understanding of social capital, but I see a lot more opportunity for it, certainly. So we're very nearly out of time. Are there any final questions anybody has, or any thoughts you'd like to share? I mentioned, we're very interested in your ideas, and just generally even what you think of this concept of cheap social capital.
Kristen, thank you for organizing this, and I'm very pleased to participate, and just thank you and for taking the initiative. This is really your work and your organization is, I really applaud you both.
Well, thank you very much, Lindon, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk with us about these issues. Greatly appreciated. So let's wrap up there. I'll stop the recording, and feel free if you'd like to stay online for a little bit of informal discussion afterwards. The next webinar we have scheduled is actually going to be one that I will do, looking at the outcomes of social capital and exploring some of the processes by which social capital actually works to produce the kinds of outcomes that we're interested in. So those details are on the website and on Eventbrite. It'll be on April the 26th if you'd like to register for that. So with that, thanks again very much, Lindon, for your time. I'll stop the recording.